Today, I have a pretty wild story for you guys. It's about this kid whose friend ends up being a furry, and the furry tries to eat him whole. Like the video or else a furry is going to eat you. And also subscribe so we can hit 420 trillion subscribers, which we're getting super close to, so just subscribe. Anyways, without any further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. So this story takes place in high school, and for this story, we're gonna call our subscriber Jimmy. So Jimmy had a tough time finding a good friend group and people that he could actually click with. He recently had a falling out with one of his other friends, and pretty much all of his previous friends also had falling outs too. Mainly because he had this weird thing where pretty much anyone who he became friends with like ended up being absolutely insane or bizarre. And this new friend that he's about to make is gonna be no different. So it was a new semester, which meant a few of the classes switched around, and Jimmy was now in woodshop. So after he finds the classroom that his new class is in, he's like the first one there, and he goes in and takes a seat. As more people start showing up, nobody is really like sitting around Jimmy. Most people in that classroom are already friends with each other, so they were just sitting in their own little groups. And Jimmy ended up sitting at this table all by himself until one last person entered the classroom and came over and sat at the same table as him. Jimmy had seen this person around a few times, like in the halls and stuff, but they really never had the chance to interact with them, and they never had any classes together or anything like that. But Casey sat down at the table and introduced themselves to Jimmy. Jimmy then introduced themselves to Casey, and throughout that day in class, they were kind of just talking to each other about stuff, and Jimmy discovered that Casey and them had a lot in common actually. They both loved the same video games and read comic books, and at first, Jimmy wasn't really too excited about this class. He only signed up for it because it fit his schedule and, got the required elective that he needed to get. But over some time, this became one of his favorite classes because this was the only class he had with Casey, and it was the only chance they really had to talk. So he would always enjoy going to see his friend at woodshop and talking about their favorite comic books and games and stuff like that. They'd also play some games online with each other, and they had a pretty strong friendship. However, there was a few weird things about Casey that Jimmy wasn't so sure about. Like, for example, if Casey and Jimmy were playing any online games or you have like a team voice chat, Casey would always say some strange stuff to the other people playing on their team. If Casey ever messed up, they'd say something like, "Sorry for being a bad boy," which is just weird, and Jimmy thought that was pretty weird too, but he mostly dismissed it because, it's just online banter, video games, whatever. But looking back at it after they know what had happened, it's really weird that they would say that, and it was also really weird that they would like bark at the other teammates. Anytime he got mad or if people were yelling at him, he would just start barking, and Jimmy said that it was just a little unsettling how realistic the bark sounded. It was as if he was practicing barking or something. But once again, he just dismissed that at first because he assumed it was just online banter. He never thought it was anything weird. And one last weird thing about Casey that Jimmy picked up on was his profile picture on Discord. It was this drawing of like a hybrid between a wolf and a fox, but it also had like human features to it too. And yeah, Jimmy thought that was pretty weird, so he asked Casey about it at one point, and Casey was like, "Oh, that's supposed to be me." Once again, Jimmy just kind of dismissed it, laughed it off. But he says looking back at it now, all of these things are so weird to him. And while that was true, they still remained friends, and they would play games and talk to each other in class all the time. And one day during class, Casey ended up asking Jimmy if they wanted to come over and hang out and play some games at his house. And Jimmy, of course, agreed. And after school that day, he went home with Casey. And this was kind of the first time that they were hanging out outside of school and not online. So when they finally arrive, they go inside, and Jimmy says the first thing that he notices is all the weird decorations around Casey's house. His walls were all covered in art with these like landscapes with all these weird animals, like animals that didn't even exist, drawn all over them. And it looked cool, but it was pretty weird to see somebody's house just have these murals all over their walls. He also said that there was a shelf like right whenever you walk into the house that had a bunch of animal figurines all over them and these weirdly shaped masks. And it was just kind of weird. It was kind of creeping him out. Like the masks looked really creepy. There were just so many animal figurines and it was just weird, So they go into the living room, which is where Casey's PlayStation and Xbox is. And Casey is explaining to him one of the new games that he got. And Casey's just sitting there, kind of listening, but also observing observing around what's going on in the house, and he notices that there's this foxtail just sitting on the couch, which was really weirding him out. But then he also saw a pair of animal ears that were on a bookshelf, like right next to it. Jimmy didn't say anything because he assumed maybe it was like his parents or something, or I don't know what he thought, but he just ignored it kind of. It's like Casey gave all of the hints, but Jimmy just couldn't put together the clues, you know? But soon enough, he wouldn't have to be putting together any clues, and the insane truth of Casey will be revealed. It's wild, okay? Or I don't know what he thought, but he just ignored it kind of. So they spent a few hours playing games, taking turns on different ones and other ones playing against each other. And you know, they talked a little bit about whatever, BS'd around a bit. And as Jimmy's time at Casey's house was coming to a close, Casey out of nowhere sprung up and said, "Hey, I've got something really cool to show you. Follow me." Now, Jimmy had no idea what Casey could have been talking about here. He said that they seemed really excited about it, so he followed and was just pretty curious about what he was going to be shown this whole entire time. So Casey starts leading Jimmy down this hallway until eventually towards the end of it, they pull up to this room. And now Jimmy says that this room was, to put it mildly, unexpected. Casey opens up the door and turns on the lights and waves Jimmy to come on in. And as Jimmy walks into this room that's more like a closet, and all he sees is a ton of these animal costumes hanging up. It looked like different mascots from sports or something, or that's what he thought it was at first. And there was a bunch of them, Jimmy says. There's probably like 20 or 30 of them, which it's very strange to have that many costumes. Like, what's the reason behind it, you know? So Jimmy at first thinks that these are mascot costumes, like I said, but then in the corner there was these baskets that had a bunch of different tails and ears and different masks of different animals and all different types of shapes and sizes. It was then that Jimmy started to put all the clues together in his head, and he realized that his friend Casey was in fact a furry. And now, not just a normal, ordinary furry, which is already honestly kind of weird, but they had this massive collection of furry stuff and a whole entire room in their house dedicated to it. You could only assume that the whole entire family was in on this. Casey was part of a furry family. Once Jimmy walked in the room and he looked around, Casey was like, "Surprise!" And then they continued on to say, "I know it's kind of weird, but I love dressing up as different animals. It's just a fun way for me to express myself." Now, Jimmy didn't want to be rude, but all they were thinking in their head was like, "What the fudge?" But he kept it cool, he kept it collected, calm, epic. He was like, you know, "Hey, it's cool." Jimmy was trying his best to sound supportive, and then he continued on to say, you know, "If it makes you happy, that's all that matters." And honestly, Jimmy says that it was taking everything in his power not to sprint for the door and get out of there. But then again, you know, he was pretty good friends with Casey, so he didn't just want to, you know, ditch him just because of this. But don't you worry, because Jimmy would soon find some more reasons that he should probably GTFO. So after Jimmy told Casey that they still support him and, you know, they're cool with this, Casey's face lit up with relief, and they were very eager to start showing Jimmy all of their different favorite costumes. And they started putting on all the different ones and explaining what they are and what they mean and their names and all of this stuff. And Jimmy just kind of sat there and took it in and nodded their head whenever they talked to them. But they were honestly extremely weirded out. As time went on, Casey kept getting more and more excited, and Jimmy says that their behavior was becoming like erratic. They were like running around the room in circles, making all these different animal noises, switching between costumes and speaking in these strange voices. Jimmy says it was as if they were transforming into the characters that they were dressing up as, and they were like playing into it, and it was just very weird and unsettling to see. But Jimmy just kind of smiled and, you know, watched, observed, and didn't really say much. But Casey was full into character. Not gonna lie, guys, if I was in this situation, I'm sorry, but I'm out of there. If I have a friend and they end up coming up to me and they're like, "Hey, I'm actually a furry," at first, you know, I'd be like, okay. Then, you know, if they just kept acting normal and didn't really like put on their suit around me or like, you know, involve me in that at all, I'd be okay with it. I'd still be friends with them, you know, like that's my friend. But if they started dressing up in a bunch of different costumes and like meowing and barking at me, roaring at me, whatever, neighing, baaing, like oinking, like absolutely not. Get away from me, man. I'm sorry, you know, it would just be way too weird for me. Like, no thanks. So anyways, Casey's running around acting like this rabid animal, and Jimmy is just absolutely freaked out at this point. But what would happen next would freak him out even more somehow, which he didn't think was even possible. So Casey ran back over to their little room with all their costumes, which they had done a bunch of times already. But this time they came out of that room and they came like tiptoeing over to Jimmy, which Jimmy didn't even realize at first, but eventually he felt their breath on his neck and he turned around and they were just standing right next to him, dressed up as this really creepy looking wolf with like a big grin on its face. And even after Jimmy turned around, they just kept standing there and breathing like very heavy right on him. It was really, really weird, really unsettling. And just as Jimmy started to be like, dude, what are you doing? Like, Casey opened up their mouth and started growling at him. Jimmy slowly got up and started to walk away from them because this was really creeping him out. Like, the stuff before was already really creeping him out, but he was keeping it to himself. But this time, you know, they were kind of crossing the line. So he gets up, starts walking away. Casey gets down on all fours and starts sprinting at them like they were a wolf themselves or something. Just as Jimmy decides he's gonna start running away, Casey lounges onto Jimmy, knocks him over on the ground, and starts like snapping their jaw at him as if they were gonna bite him. And then eventually they go in for a literal bite on his leg. And just as Jimmy's leg is about to be munched on, he pushes Casey away, starts running for his life. At this point, Jimmy's heart is racing with fear. He's absolutely terrified. Is he like at Dahmer's house right now or something? This dude was trying to literally eat him. Jimmy was yelling at him like, dude, what are you doing? Like, this is too much. I'm not trying to like play into whatever game you are. And Casey didn't respond or anything. Rather, they just kept growling and barking at him and like snapping their jaw over and over again. And Jimmy just kept asking them to stop, saying this was like way too weird for them. And Casey finally responded and said, just get into character. Don't you want to play along? And Jimmy was like, no, I don't want to play along, actually. Jimmy was like, you know, this isn't a game, Casey. You just tried to literally eat me. Jimmy says that Casey's expression kind of shifted for just a moment. They swear they saw a flicker of regret in their eyes. But then their crazed grin returned and they lunged at him again. Jimmy, just barely dodging their snapping jaws, finally decided, all right, it's time to get out of this house. Like, I'm making a run for it. At this point, Casey kind of had Jimmy cornered in the living room, and Casey just pushed past Casey as hard as he could and was literally running for his life. His heart was pounding out of his chest. He sprinted right towards the front door. The whole time he could hear Casey snarling and growling behind him, but he did not look back whatsoever. He just needed to get out. As he reached the front door, he pulled it open and got outside as fast as he could and slammed the door in Casey's face. And he just kept running and running and running and did not stop until eventually he ended up on his own front porch. At this point, he was absolutely out of breath. I mean, he just ran for nearly a mile straight, right from Casey's house all the way to his house. And Jimmy's parents see him running up to the doorstep and they meet him at the front door. They're like, what's going on? Like, are you okay? And Jimmy just ended up telling his parents absolutely everything from start to finish. You know, his parents, of course, knew that he was going to be over this friend's house, but not that the friend was going to try to eat him. Like, what? Anyways, the parents slammed the door on Jimmy's face and walked up to the room and put on their own costumes. Then they came downstairs and started growling at their son. And then they tried to eat him. Yeah, I'm just kidding, that last part, bit much. Rather, the parents were actually very concerned about this, and they ended up calling the school, and they told the school about everything that happened, and that this kid tried to eat their son because he thought he was a wolf. The school was like, there's actually, you know, nothing we could really do about this. It seems like he's just doing his own thing. And eventually, after a bunch of back and forth with the school, and them not being able to do anything about Casey, or even move any of the classes around for Jimmy to not be in the same class as Casey anymore, the parents ended up deciding to just move for their son because Jimmy did not want to go to school and be in the same class or even have a chance to see Casey ever again. They were like genuinely scared of him. So they ended up moving schools and Jimmy never saw Casey again. All of these stories are fully listenable on Spotify. Top link down below in the description or in the pinned comments. And yeah, bye.